Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our second session of the book club. Today we will be discussing chapters 2 and 3. So in this week, we will have a brief summary of week 1. We will discuss the historical/political events in chapter 2 and 3. And finally, we will provide a summary of the main ideas and themes in chapters 2 and 3.
All right, so what we did last week was provide a basic kind of structure to how the prince is and how it's split into two different sections. And then Noor gave us a beautiful summary of what to expect in the first section, because that's what Machiavelli provides in chapter 1. We then looked at kind of the history which was happening when Machiavelli was around, and the events which inspired the prince, and then future events which were inspired by the prince as well. And then we looked at Machiavelli's life and the potential reasons which may have caused him to write this book, and the interesting mode in which he decided to deliver this information. So it is presented as a letter to Lorenzo de' Medici II, but as we kind of discussed last week, Machiavelli is the enemy of the Medici, so it doesn't really make sense he would provide them with the means to rule his beloved Florence. Instead, there are many theories which suggest that he wrote this book not to be taken literally, but to expose how princes rule, and it was meant to be picked up by people who would be able to use this information and hopefully get rid of the Medici and any kind of tyrannical princes which existed in the era. Unfortunately, Machiavelli died before any of the Medicis were taken away from Florence. But yeah, that's what we talked about last week.
Thank you, Mariam. All right, so right now we will be discussing some of the historical events that happened in chapter 2. So Machiavelli states that it is easier to govern a hereditary state rather than a new principality for many reasons. Firstly, people who support the ruler of such states are familiar with the prince's family and therefore accustomed to their rules. In a hereditary state, people may be ruled by the same family for decades/centuries and therefore may not even perceive overthrowing the prince as an option. However, as long as the prince remains faithful, in quotation marks, because the prince may be perceived as faithful to the people, but deep down, all he cares about is fame, power and money. But in front of the people, he seems like he cares about them. They will always love him and want to keep him as their ruler. However, when the prince commits some horrible acts against his people, that's when the people will start questioning the legitimacy and justice of the prince. Even if the prince is overthrown from a hereditary state, Machiavelli states that the prince may very easily be able to regain his power if the outside conqueror faces any setbacks, no matter how powerful they may be. Why is this the case? So this may happen if the new conqueror does not deliver his promises, or the people may be afraid of change and aren't confident in the new ruler. The Duke of Ferrara is a perfect example of a prince who was very well known to his people, and he came from a family who ruled for a long time. So the Duke of Ferrara was a member of the House of Este. He ruled from 1471 until 1505. The House of Este was an Italian princely family linked with several royal dynasties at the time, including the House of Habsburg, which is a ruling family in Austria, and the British royal family. The Duke of Ferrara was able to withstand two separate attacks due to being a well-established prince in a hereditary state. So the first attack that he was able to stand against was the War of Ferrara, also known as the Salt War. So this war happened in between 1482 to 1484 between the Duke of Ferrara, Pope Sixtus IV, and also the Venetians. And as their name suggests, they come from Venice.
After Venice did the peace treaty with the Ottoman Empire, they are the only legal vendors of salt in the peninsula. But then the Duke of Ferrara decides that he's going to take over the salt works in Comacchio, and that's
Yeah.
what kind of gets the Venetians antsy. And so they ask the Pope if they can confront the Duke of Ferrara, and he gives them permission to form what is called a visidominio, which is kind of take a segment and kind of rule it so that they can overlook everything. And then the Bishop of Ferrara excommunicates them, and they're like, okay, this is war.
The Pope and the Venetians, they conspire against the Duke of Ferrara. However, the Pope appears to have had a change of heart, concerned of the threat that Venice may be put in an uncomfortably strong position in mainland northern Italy. The Pope speaks to the Venetians and tells them to stop the attack. The Venetians decline this offer and they continue with the attack. And the Pope, the Duke of Ferrara, they come together and they basically go against the Venetians. At the end, they reach a treaty of Bagnolo, which basically puts everything back in position. No one gains anything, but the Duke of Ferrara remains in power. The second attack was done by the Pope Julius II. He was intending to curb Venetian influence in northern Italy. He brought together the League of Cambrai, which is an anti-Venetian alliance consisting of him, Louis XII, which is the King of France, and the King of Aragon, and the Holy Roman Emperor. Although the League was initially successful, friction between Julius and Louis caused it to collapse. By 1510, Julius then allied himself with Venice against France. However, to start his campaign against the French, Julius first set his sights on the Duchy of Ferrara, and after many unsuccessful attempts, Pope Julius II was never able to defeat the Duke of Ferrara.
So what I found interesting in what Machiavelli says is that he says it's okay, it's easy for a person to kind of follow into the footsteps of their ancestors, but it's not necessarily the right thing to do, in your opinion.
I think, like, when you're talking about like politics and kind of like succession of power and all that, there's like a lot of I think factors that I think Machiavelli, he goes into them pretty well, but when I was reading it, it felt a little bit black and white at times, kind of saying that like, oh, it's a lot easier to kind of like gain power or like become a prince as like a successor rather than to take over another territory. Whereas I think I was like this year I was studying the Russian Revolution with Tsar Nicholas II, and that's another example of taking power from his father.
Yeah.
But that still eventually resulted, like his rule only lasted, I think he was brought into power in 1895, I believe, and that ended in 1917. So again, another very short rule, because it's not always only about, succeeding power and kind of maintaining like reputation that has been formally set. There's also kind of like adapting to the new times, which we see with like the imams and all them, when like they like reach new power, like when they kind of get the khilafat, they are able to not only kind of like hold and maintain that power, but adapt it to new scenarios, which is kind of what allowed for the survival of Islam in the end.
So just adding to that, I think having that hereditary element just like lays the base for the Khilafah, for example. And it just ultimately, like, the author, he's ultimately right, I think, when he says, like, at the start I was like, oh, like, I shouldn't agree with him, but he's right. Like, it's just a more effective and more practical
to build on something which exists.
Yeah. And it was displayed with the imams, I think.
I mean, I feel like there's another thing with the imams is that it could very well have been non-hereditary, because ultimately it wasn't about who was your father, but who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose when it came. But the reason why they were selected is because they were the most knowledgeable and the most capable of being so at the time. That's why it was only one child and not all the children of the imams. Like we know Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam had many, many children just because the circumstances at the time, I believe it was Harun al-Rashid during the time of Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam, he was killing all his children. To ensure that at least one of them would survive and become the next Imam was very important. But he knew exactly which one it would have been. So he had to keep that one safe, and the others, their role, their duty, they knew it, and it was to sacrifice themselves to keep the Imamah alive. So they had their own jobs and their own roles, but who was selected to be the Imam was, it was less hereditary and more to do with the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But definitely hereditary has a component because, I mean, we don't, I guess, recognize it these days, but most of the stuff, the people that we were and the opportunities which are delivered to us are all from our parents, whether that be from our genome or the environment they provide us. So hereditary does have a huge influence. And I mean, that's why people in the olden days, you kind of inherited your parents' business, I guess, because you were born and raised into that, and you also have the capability for it.
I think it was that point that you mentioned there, kind of talking about the environment that we're raised in, because I was talking with Ali Sharvan about this the other day, talking about kind of like the role and like the succession of the imams and all that, how important was like the hereditary element, like what was really what kind of gave them that authority. And if you look at like with all the imams and the Anbiya, you see the people who are very close to them, even if they didn't know them like immediately from a young age, they were like very strongly impacted by them. So then for the imams to kind of be and the Anbiya to be raised in kind of that very holy environment is kind of what ultimately I think gave them that authority by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like kind of not the combination of it because it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will, but that's what gave them the ability to kind of fulfill their roles. And I think like that was kind of the point where I kind of began having problems with Machiavelli a little bit. Not problems, but I think he like oversimplified it a bit, because if we go back, this is where a lot of like my knowledge lies with Tsar Nicholas II. His father died, I think he was like expecting for like another 20 years of kind of like training to become a leader, but with the death, because he became leader when he was I think in his late 20s. So to kind of have all that responsibility dumped on him, even though there was like a great love for the royal family and there was a lot of support, that kind of inexperience, even though he was already in a very stable position, was I think what eventually toppled the monarchy there.
I mean, I agree, and I think that links into what Machiavelli says in chapter 3. Not to jump ahead or anything, but the fact that he was inexperienced and unaware of what was entering his kingdom. Because the thing is, it's not only about the people who come, it's also about the ideas that come. And that's, I feel, the war at the moment. This is the more dangerous sides of everything, because what happened during the reign of Tsar Nicholas II was that the Communist Manifesto had just entered into Russia, and not having an awareness of what that book contained, I think, was what led to, say, the October Revolution and the events spiraling after that as well. But if we go to the political sphere, we understand that it also doesn't have to be purely hereditary. It's more about, the environment and the family, I guess. So there are many examples in British history where not the first in line to the throne takes the throne, say, or the queen, which was born up, say, in French or Spanish courts, ends up taking the rule because, the next in line is only a few months old and that kind of thing. So it's about the environment and understanding the political sphere. So having that education, which of course has some element which comes from the hereditary, but it also comes from the education and the environment you grow up with. And that's also important. But given the lifestyle at the time, it was more linked to who your family was than today.
That's right. Because that
Today,
links back to what you.
alhamdulillah, we have more opportunities to have an education and get into these fields, whereas at that time, it was more connected to who your father was, what family you come from.
I was just saying in the book, when he talks about like hereditary principalities, he doesn't like, he kind of says also that it won't work if you just pass it down from family member to family member, and that the new ruler must also learn to adapt and have skill as well. So if your family member is corrupt or is power hungry, then even Machiavelli says that won't work out, because the ruler always must have the skills.
Exactly, spot on. And for this, I just want to actually add on. So when we say it's easy to pass on, it might be in terms of practicality. But if you, for example, see the existing ruler or the existing prince, let's say, is unjust or being, unfair, or like, has certain, horrible practices against the people, obviously, people wouldn't want to continue with him. The thing is, the practicality and the easy part of things is people normally resist change. And another thing that we can sort of links back to what Mariam's also mentioned when she said, it's not about who's the person, but it's about who Allah chooses to be the imam. Or they say it's not just about the imams, it also goes back to the prophets. I know prophethood and imamathood is different, but in terms of a concept of passing on to the next generation or to the next son, we also have in prophets, we have the asbat, where we also have like a prophet follows another prophet, like it comes from Prophet Ibrahim, Prophet Ishaq, and we have Ismail, and from Ishaq we have Yaqub, Yusuf, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's a good example. Like, there is a reason why Yusuf was selected and not his other 11 brothers. There's a reason why the son of Prophet Nuh alayhi salam was not a follower. So it's not purely hereditary. It's selected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
What also I wanted to say, just to give a supportive evidence to what you guys have already mentioned, how like it's not about hereditary, it's not about passing on to the next son. There is this verse in Quran with an example from Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala declares that he has made him an imam, and Prophet Ibrahim asks Allah, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي, what about my offsprings? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states that لَا يَنَالُ عَهْدِ الظَّالِمِينَ. So it will be not passed on to those who are unjust or who would be doing dhulm to themselves, without going into details into what this dhulm is, whether it's to the self or being sinful or being unjust to the people. We're just taking it more objectively, just so we can see, because the way how Machiavelli presents his points, we're just trying to sort of draw the lines and see the similarities and whether it's similar or not. But there is no doubt, we're not saying that, oh, no, it's like hereditary or not. There's no doubt that it's divinely selected, and is supported by a segment from Ziyarat Ashura, where it says, لعن الله الذين أزالكم عن مراتبكم التي رتبكم الله فيها. So all of them, they have been given these positions, they have been given this status, and definitely it's divinely selected.
You could also say that, like, as a part of this divine selection, I don't think it's a coincidence or like chance that they're all family or they're all related by blood. Like, I think a part of that divine selection, a big part of it, is the fact that they're family. And so I think the hereditary element comes into it in a more divine kind of way, rather than just, a monarchy or like any other.
Exactly. Yes.
Spot on.
The reason we need to understand, say, the non-spiritual side of it is because there's a lot of manipulation occurring these days, and we need to understand the politics and, say, the modern understanding, so that we can differentiate between them, so that we don't fall into traps in the future.
Yeah, because this is one of the ways how, unfortunately, the mission of Imam Hussein being misunderstood, because some people portray that Imam Hussein rose to basically
For
for
power.
the status and for
Yeah.
power, and basically to regain what Imam Ali, you know, basically had in the past. So and obviously Imam Hussein alayhi salam, definitely this was not his mission whatsoever. In this segment, we will be addressing a summary for Chapter 3. Chapter 3 addresses the concept of mixed principalities. We have just discussed the idea of hereditary principalities, and we have explained the reasons why it might be easier to maintain the governing in such an environment of a hereditary principality. Now, this chapter addresses a different environment, and that is an example of mixed principalities, or like how Machiavelli calls it, a composite principality, being a mixture of an old as well as a new state. He argues that it's quite difficult to maintain, and he explains a few reasons for this difficulty. He says because one of the reasons is due to false promises, because the people normally are willing to sort of give up on their existing ruler if he's doing injustice to them, or they're not satisfied with him. So they would give in to the new prince. But once they realize the new prince is not basically giving them or satisfying them, or not meeting their hopes, and they realize it's basically all what he promised them, they were just false promises, then they will basically easily give up on him. And the second reason is that the new prince would basically end up forming enemies. All these subjects that in the acquired state, they would be injured, they would be affected throughout the occupation process, and that would be another issue. And another difficulty Machiavelli talks about is that allies cannot be kept to friends, because you will never ever be able to satisfy them. Although they were supporters to you, they helped you in sort of acquiring that new state, you sort of can't take strong measures against them, because you sort of, no matter how powerful you are and how powerful your forces are, you still need to maintain goodwill with them. And at this point, Machiavelli addresses how acquiring a rebellious province for the second time, it won't be easy to lose it again. And he lays out the reasons why that was the case. And that's because he learned how to, like from his previous experience, how to punish the perpetrator, and also sort out all the suspects, fix any weaknesses, and sort them out. And then Machiavelli moved to another very important point, and that is the importance of language, culture, customs and laws, and even the geographical location of the acquired states. And he gives two scenarios. In the first scenario, he talks about what strategy the prince should take in acquiring a region where the culture, the language is similar. So in that scenario, he says, to be able to maintain governance in such a region, you need only two things. You need to eliminate and kill all the family members of the state's former prince, number one. Number two, you need to make sure you maintain the laws and keep the taxes unchanged for that particular state. And that would make it even more easier for you if the type of people of that particular region are not accustomed to freedom. And then Machiavelli moves to the other example, or the other scenario, where the prince will need to sort of adapt a different strategy where the region has a different culture or have different languages and so on and so forth. So he gives different strategies. The first one is the prince needing to reside in the new state, and he gives several benefits of such a strategy, that the prince would be able to sort out any rising problems. If the people are loyal to him, they will be able to show his love and loyalty to him. If people don't like him, they will fear to do anything against his will. He moves on to another strategy, which is sending colonies, and that can be another successful strategy in a region where culture is different. And he says in this example, it costs little to nothing. And that's because you only need to bother few people. And those people who you will be bother them, they will be only a minority. And those minority they will be scattered, they will be poor, they will be unable to sort of take revenge. So that is the second strategy. And then the third strategy he talks about is that sending military forces. And Machiavelli calls this as useless, because you will have these forces that you will basically need to feed them, you need to basically pay for them, you need to give them the equipment, you need to give them the weapons to be able to continue. So that's one reason. Another reason is that they will do harm to the people of that new state. And even if they are broken, the people of that state, they are still on their lands. So that's basically give them power. And in any instance, they can sort of overcome you. And the last advice that potentially is the most powerful that Machiavelli gives to a prince ruling in a region with different culture is that be in control of the power of the region. So, and that is through recognizing the weaker states in the surrounding and trying to be the defender of them, and also weaken the more powerful states, or at least stay as a friend with them without giving them more power, avoiding bringing foreign powers into your new states.
So a lot of this will kind of be giving a bit more of an in-depth look at kind of a little bit of what Hanin mentioned before, a few more of the kind of like external factors at play, and maybe some like specific actions taken by leaders and individuals, which were either kind of condemned or commended by Machiavelli. One of the first historical examples that he gave is the Ottoman Empire. So that was, 1453, I believe it was May 29th. So this, when Machiavelli begins discussing the Ottoman Empire in this period, it's kind of the relationship, what was happening at the time. The Byzantine Empire was kind of like on its kind of last legs, as the Ottoman Empire was kind of coming north. Pretty much under the rule of Sultan Mehmed II, the Ottoman Empire was able to put an end to the Byzantine Empire's 1,000 years of like rule in the region. And this was focusing more on with cultures from different backgrounds. So what's important to note here is that although the Ottomans may have initially taken Constantinople, which was the capital of the Byzantine Empire at the time, there was still quite a high risk of, perhaps a rebellion or kind of a resurgence, but the rulership might have come back. So there was always that possibility. So what Machiavelli kind of commends in that scenario is that not only did they take Constantinople, but after they did that, the Sultan, he moved the capital of the empire to Constantinople, which was now modern-day Istanbul. And, from there, the Ottoman Empire was kind of able to, because they'd already consolidated their power in those other regions, which they'd already kind of gathered, and this new kind of bridge between the Middle East and Europe at the time. Okay, now moving on to some of the more detailed examples. So the Romans' influence in Italy, say from 211 years before Christ, or Nabi Isa alayhi salam, and then 196 BC. Initially in 211 BC, the Aetolians asked the aid for the Romans to fight Philip V of Macedon. Yep. And then the Romans accepted this. They were like, yep, we'll help you out. Using that kind of position of power, which the Romans already held, they were able to use Aetolians, as he says in the book, a colony in the region. So he was kind of able to make political and strategic moves without having to, risk any of his own resources. So then in response to this kind of agreement or alignment between the Aetolians and the Romans, the more powerful Philip V offered an alliance with the Romans. Now, in a lot of scenarios, a lot of people be like, oh, you should really choose to side with the more powerful faction rather than the weaker ones, who were the Aetolians, who wanted to destabilize and take over the region, which Philip V was controlling. But Machiavelli kind of very strongly emphasizes that it's very important when conquering a new region to not give power to those who are already in power, because they have already more of a position of power within that area, that region, and their influence is going to be greater. And if they do decide to not support a weaker power and gain kind of support over time, but instantly go for a much larger power, it could put them at risk of losing power that they gain together due to a power imbalance between the two sides. Accepting Philip V's offer would also have avoided a war. And in a lot of scenarios, a lot of people would think, we should avoid war at all costs and, world peace. But Machiavelli, the way he kind of discussed it, although, it may not have been the most morally correct move, depending on how you think about it, him rejecting Philip V's offer kind of confirmed that there would be a war sooner or later. And this was actually an advantage for the Romans because by this stage, they had already gained lots of support within the region with the Aetolians, and there was another faction, another smaller one, who wanted to also overthrow
It was the
Philip V.
Archeans?
I think Archeans, yeah.
Yeah.
So all those kind of smaller powers kind of united underneath the Romans, and then from there, with that combined power, they were able to eventually defeat him. So this occurred in the Second Macedonian War, so as in the years mentioned, of 200 to 196 BC. Philip V was defeated at Cynocephalae in Thessaly, where they were kind of able to defeat the kind of key power in the region, which had stood there for a while at the time. And then following this, the Aetolians, in an attempt to kind of take more power, which even though they'd already gained some under the Romans, they knew that they were at a disadvantaged state. So they formed an alliance with Antiochus III of Syria. But because the Romans didn't accept the agreement with Philip V, it meant that they didn't have to really share their power with anyone. And they kind of held all the cards in that scenario. So they were able to easily crush that small rebellion and kind of maintain control over the region. Now, King Louis XII in the Second Italian War it's some important background history, I think, is that Charles VII of France, he had kind of cut off a lot of the alliances and kind of agreements that had been made with a lot of the Italian states. So when following his death on the 7th of April 1948, King Louis immediately entered a deal with the Venetians, where they agreed that they would attack Milan using their own military as well as smaller hired militias, and they would give up half of Lombardy as well, so that they could kind of gain a foothold in the region. Machiavelli criticizes most of the actions King Louis took in the Second Italian War and the kind of events leading up to it, but with this kind of getting a foothold in the region, he doesn't criticize it at all. He says that it was kind of necessary if France was wanting to kind of expand their power into one of the more prosperous regions at the time. So following their victory at Milan, Louis had kind of control and kind of great influence over 2/3 of the kind of fractured Italian region. And from there onwards, he was in a very strong position to kind of align with a lot of the smaller powers and consolidate the power that he already had, just as the Romans had previously. But instead, King Louis aligned himself with Pope Alexander VI, and that was a kind of fatal error, I guess, in their influence over the region, because after he aided them in catching Romana in 1494, the church was in a very, very strong position at this point, and there wasn't much that the French could do to kind of resist any demands or advances made by the church. This kind of alignment with the church also isolated many of the weaker states that King Louis XII had already aligned himself with, because they didn't want to be under that direct influence of the church, and they still wanted to hold that independence and the small amount of power that they had by aligning with other smaller factions to kind of grow their power, which is what King Louis XII should have done. So this eventually led to Naples kind of being exposed because of the lost agreement with the Venetians over quite a short period of time. And this was in the kind of Second Italian Wars, where people were constantly changing sides, and it was a very chaotic time. They lost their connections with the Venetians. He lost his power in Naples, and quite quickly the French began to lose their influence in the kind of Italian region, even though only a few years prior they had a pretty good control and influence over 2/3 of the area. And then finally, the final criticism made by Machiavelli is that with Spain kind of having newly united, because there was a lot of warring and all that in Spain previously, them having united and them being quite close to the western border of France, they were afraid of an invasion, considering they already had quite a few forces down in the Italian area. In order to avoid a war, he signed a deal with Spain known as the Treaty of Granada on the 11th of November 1500, where he agreed to have the spoils of Naples, even though he kind of already was in a very precarious position with his power over Naples.
So I'll just go over quickly how composite principalities are kind of a mix, as Hanin very well summarized, and that they're more easily maintained and conquered through force. And he encourages the rulers to use revolts in their favor and tells them to take advantage of the opportunity to reassert their power and to reorganize their states. And he advises rulers to adopt harsh measures, and the skillful use of arms and punishments form an important part of that governance. And so I think in modern day politics, we see that a lot with leaders, especially those historically who feel or have that shift to the right, use the concept of law and order to govern their states, and that a lot of people support that, and the people like the civilians and all support that kind of approach. And Machiavelli definitely has that kind of pragmatic approach of using law and order or arms and punishment. And so I think that's one way we can relate it. There's obviously like a whole different list of examples of leaders who've done that. He also advises any leader to approach their problems very directed and head on, which means that they launch physical and like more harsher attacks on their states. That doesn't necessarily mean war or like warfare, but also in economic terms, like how China, for example, uses sanctions and economic kind of force and coercion.
Sanctions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Also, knowledge can be used in the exact same way.
Yeah.
You know how like the Cold War worked. It wasn't a real war, but it was the war of knowledge and the war of innovation, I guess.
Yeah.
So so basically when we think about what he means by being physically or like coercive, I think we need to broaden the view of kind of what that means, not necessarily just warfare and guns and like wars and all that. So there's a lot of different ways that can present itself. Through my research or through like uni as well, like I've learned about it as well, is this kind of concept of psychological egoism. It's like how people are always motivated to minimize the harm and maximize benefits for themselves. And how they perceive that will dictate whether or not the prince or the leader will be tolerated by the people, or whether or not they'll have him removed. So it's kind of a tactic of manipulation that a lot of politicians use to kind of trick the people into thinking that the best thing is happening, or like the best case scenario is occurring. And the definition of this is individuals that are driven only by the desire to get what they want, that for each person only his or her own preference and well-being have fundamental value. And this assumption is really a cornerstone of a lot of modern political thought, which is why Machiavelli's book, The Prince, obviously is seen as one of the first modern political philosophies. And that also kind of links to the concept of realism, which is a really broad spectrum as well. And a lot of, from my research, I've seen a lot of people or like scholars say that he's not a realist, but he also is. And I think the way I see it is that there are kind of people who are realists and people who are utopians, and he definitely doesn't come under the utopian standpoint. And I think last week, I think Mariam it was, when you compared the Prince to the Communist Manifesto, and you said that the Communist Manifesto and Marx and his kind of thinking is really idealistic, whereas Machiavelli is very realist, and he's definitely served as an inspiration to a lot of political realists or neoclassic realists in modern day politics as well. And there's this quote that he says that the effectual truth for him is the only truth worth seeking. That's basically a lot of what realism is about. One of the definitions is that it's an approach to politics rooted in a cynical view of human motives and possibilities, and devoted to advancing the interests of a state without regard for moral or religious structures. I think that definition is very much kind of a cynical definition of realism, and Machiavelli doesn't have that kind of criticism towards morals.
I understand what you mean. I mean, in a few of the chapters, he specifically says that this is not what I would recommend, but I am not presenting the moral truth. I am presenting what occurs, kind of thing. And also, what Machiavelli gets attacked a lot for is that he wasn't a religious person, given what he talks about, except he was a very, very devoted Christian.
Yeah. And I think also from research, I've seen that ancient definition of what virtue is, and he kind of redefines what virtue is. And that's more related to ability and vigor and like something that is really different from what others have said. So I think that's also a part of it. But that's going into other chapters too much, so I don't want to do that. But I just thought that he definitely is a realist in my perspective.
I mean, this chapter, I feel like it's a summary of many of the concepts he's going to go into in the rest of the book. But if we look at it as a summary to a lot of the book, we can kind of pretty much copy and paste the scenarios which he uses in the book on our modern life. And America is a very, very good example of this. So let's say America in the Middle East, or the Europeans, or the West in the Middle East. So the first thing they did was they sent their spies. So Hemfer in the 18th century went to the Middle East to kind of suss everything out, and Lawrence of Arabia. And then they picked out the weak tribes, weak in terms of they really didn't have a strong religious influence, but they had a really strong culture. So if we look at, say, you know how he says, weaken their strong laws and strengthen their weak law. So if we look at religion as the strong law and culture as the weak law, that's kind of what they've done to the Middle East. They've strengthened culture and weakened religion so that they could manipulate, let's say, the movement of the truth. Something else that they did was they moved and they found Al Saud. And they gave them all the power. They were the weakest in the region. I mean, the Ottoman Empire was right there, but they give the power to the Al Saud. And people say, "Oh no, that was just so that they can get the oil."
They actually used another tribe to basically win the region. But when they won, they promised this tribe, you know, with money, power. But this tribe didn't want to basically listen to whatever, you know, the West tells them to do. So they got rid of them. They used them as a mean to basically win the region, and then they put Al Saud instead of them, because Al Saud basically just listened to whatever they're told.
Yeah, exactly. We can consider them as the colonies, as per se.
Yeah.
And then look at modern Imarat, modern Qatar. They're also the colonies of the West in the Middle East. And that's because it's the cheaper option for them, rather than to have their soldiers there all the time. And it's also a way to facilitate this kind of false sense of security for the people living there. So they can't put their forces there because they know that rebellion would work, rather than the fear of man is greater than the fear of man is not greater than the fear of God in Muslims' eyes. So it wouldn't work in that sense.
Exactly. They basically divided up the Middle East, just like how Italy used to be in the 15th and 16th century.
Mm-hmm.
They divided it into small colonies and small countries so that, you know, they're always divided and they will never come together.
Mm. But I mean, something else we need to understand is that we are the colonies of Islam in the West, meaning we have a duty as well to understand this system that we're currently living in and to make sure that we're not getting weakened, but in due time we are able to get into positions where we can have an influence as well, and that's really important too in the future. Yeah, and that links to what Machiavelli says about you have to be like a doctor, look at the future and then plan. I mean, we know what the future is, and we want to be part of that future when the Imam comes. So it's our time to, work on our role. We are here on, say, the other side, so we have a different role to play than those who are in the Middle East. And Noor spot on said that it's not going to be a fist fight, pretty much. It's going to be the war of knowledge. It's going to be a soft version of war rather than a physical version of war. But we have to be
And
ready.
those are the most scary.
And they are.
Exactly. Yeah.
They are.
You get like
Because
you get like
they
a
hit you when
safe.
you least expect it.
Yeah, we don't want to be like France. We
Yeah.
have to make sure we're not like France. I really liked when he was providing advice. He was saying that men are happy to change their ruler if they believe it's advantageous to them. And this is a really practical thing because it's part of our human nature to do so. I mean, we generally try to avoid hard work or any situation which we deem uncomfortable. And he also says that if it doesn't come to that, they will rebel against them, but this rebellion will never work. It's like they are deceiving themselves because you are the upper power and they are the weaker power. And I kind of linked that to a very strong and prominent Islamic concept, which is kufr. So kuffar, they, believe in their alternative truth and try to cover the real truth which exists out there because it's not advantageous to them. It doesn't follow what their desires and what they want from the world. So they deceive themselves with this alternative truth, which they believe in, but obviously we know in the hereafter they're going to be the failures. Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us on our second session of MMBC, where we analysed chapters 2 and 3. As we said last week, the first half of the book is generally more political, but we will try to include some more practical applications rather than just the politics and the history behind it when analysing these chapters. Hopefully that you join us for next week as we look at chapters 3 and 4. See you then.